Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu sitting in for Riz Khan. Do divisions within the G20 prevent it from being effective on key international issues? When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, the G7 group of leading industrial nations welcomed emerging nations in the efforts to reverse the economic downturn. But now that the financial crisis has eased, there are concerns that a lack of leadership and competing economic interests have left the global economy as vulnerable as ever. Some say the result could be more conflict over crucial issues like financial regulation, trade policy, and climate change. The Group of 20 will meet in Paris for the first summit of 2011 this weekend. We ask whether the bloc has the political and economic will to drive a truly international agenda. A reminder, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments, and of course you can send us an SMS or email, and we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me now from New York is Nouriel Roubini, chairman of Roubini Global Economics. He's also a professor of economics at New York's University's Stern School of Business. He's famously known for predicting the 2008 collapse of the housing market and worldwide recession 2 years before they happened. Also joining me from New York is Ian Bremmer, the founder and president of the Eurasia Group, a leading global political risk and consulting firm. He's also author of the bestseller The End of the Free Market: Who Wins the War Between States and Corporations. In it, he examines the emergence of state capitalism and its long-term threat to the global economy. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Ian, we know what the G20 is. It's this group of 20 countries, developed and developing nations, which take a lead in trying to, or rather trying to lead global governance in economic and political matters. But we haven't heard of the G0 until very recently. It's a term you coined. We heard a lot about it at the World Economic Forum in Davos just a few weeks ago. What exactly is the G0?
Well, we believe the G20 is aspirational, much as the Security Council in the United Nations in terms of trying to create global order on the national security side, the G20 trying to create global order on the economic side. But the G0 is analytic. It's where we actually are. And it talks about a world that does not have leadership. It doesn't have governance. When the G7 became the G20, you added a lot of countries, made it much more difficult to coordinate. The countries don't share the same basic values on main issues like climate, on currency, on trade, on standards. And while it looked like it functioned for a few months when everyone was panicking, in reality, that was still the G7 with a bunch of emerging markets saying, we don't want to rock the boat, we want to make sure we get out of this recession. Now that we've gotten through that, it's very, very obvious that the world lacks leadership. And right now, the reality of this new world order, particularly this new world economic order, is indeed a G0 where nobody has the interest or the capacity to step up and provide a leadership role.
Nouriel, if indeed the world lacks leadership right now, and if the G20 countries are actually competing against each other, that they have divergent interests at heart, what is the danger of this lack of leadership?
The danger that there's going to be more economic and financial conflicts among countries, not just between the United States and China, but there are major differences between US, Europe, and Japan, between China, Brazil, India, and other emerging markets on all the fundamental economic and financial issues. There are disagreements on monetary and fiscal policy. There is disagreements about exchange rates. There are disagreements about trade. There are disagreements about the global climate change. There are disagreements on how to reform the system of supervision and regulation of financial institutions. There are disagreements on how to reform the international monetary system. And there are major disagreements, of course, on all the issues about global security, including also new issues like food security or energy security and things of that sort. So if these agreements lead to conflict, you could have economic wars. Currency tensions are leading now to currency wars, and currency wars can end up into protectionism and trade wars. That's the kind of risk we're facing right now in a world in which countries think of economic issues as a zero-sum game as opposed to a positive-sum game. And if it is seen as a zero-sum game, it is a G0 world.
So you're saying that because there is this vacuum, one of the consequences could be conflict, and you talk about economic conflict. Could that escalate into physical conflict?
Well, I mean, the economic conflict is increasingly what security is all about. I mean, when you have cyber espionage that's being supported by governments going after the corporate secrets and technology, whether you're talking about big oil and gas firms, whether you're talking about technology firms, whether you're talking about Google, that is increasingly hitting at the heart of the vitality of these countries. I don't believe that we're concerned about a hot war breaking out between the United States and China, two nuclear-armed countries, but I think that effectively we are seeing economic conflict, and the manifestations of that economic conflict are very severe for both the direct participants as well as all the bystanders.
Nouriel, what about those who argue that it's not actually G0, it's G everybody? I looked at a report by Aaron Kramer, he's a consultant who was at the Davos World Economic Forum, and he cited the launch of WindMade, which is an alternative energy source, as evidence of the fact that everybody is now involved in this.
Certainly the internet and social media are showing that there are powers that are coming outside of government, non-governmental institutions, popular movements, and certainly some of the things that have happened right now in the Middle East, from Tunisia to Egypt and so on, may be driven by the power of things like Facebook and other social media. And there are these non-governmental institutions, and that's another center of global economic power. But increasingly, still the nation states have to sit together and debate and agree on fundamental economic, trading, financial, climate, security issues. And among these governments, there are increasing disagreements, let alone the issue of having involved those who are not governmental institutions.
Nouriel, you say the nation states have to sit together, but isn't the US still the de facto leader in the world when it comes to global trade and financial rules? I mean, we often hear of the decline of America's influence around the world, yet the United States still controls key institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, for that matter.
Not to mention the world's reserve currency, the US dollar. But of course, all of these institutions are starting to be chipped away at in terms of their efficacy globally. Look, we're 2 years right now into the Obama administration. There is no Obama doctrine. There was a Bush doctrine. A lot of people didn't like it. There was a Carter doctrine. There was a Clinton doctrine, a Reagan doctrine. But the United States, as reflected by its politics, doesn't have much interest in providing the level of global leadership that it once did. It doesn't support being a global policeman. It doesn't support the same degree of globalization because many Americans feel like they've been left behind and they don't benefit from it. And so, you know, not only does the United States have somewhat less capacity to provide public goods, given the enormous importance and rising importance of countries like China internationally, but also they have less political will to provide that sort of lifting. And you only need to look at the present gridlock in the United States between Obama and Democrats and Republicans in Congress to understand that very clearly.
Nouriel, do you believe...
And certainly from a financial point of view, I would add that the U.S. is fiscally overstretched. It cannot spend as much in global aid, even in global security, as it did before. So the huge budget deficit of the United States, over $1 trillion for the next decade every year, is going to be constrained to the ability of the U.S. to provide global public goods and provide global leadership.
But politically, the United States is still being seen as the dominant power, and is perceived as that by most of the world. I mean, if we look at some of the major issues that beset the world today, for instance, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I mean, we don't see Beijing come up with a plan to resolve that. If we look at the Sudan conflict, we don't see New Delhi come up with a plan for that. It's always the United States. Everybody looks to Washington for a solution.
Yes, that's correct, but the reality is that the U.S. cannot impose its will on the world anymore. There are a whole series of geopolitical issues, from North to South Korea, to Taiwan, to Iran, Israel, to peace in the Middle East, to what's happening right now. And the U.S. is not anymore in a position which can decide for everybody else. It needs the cooperation of other great powers, but there is disagreement among these great powers on these fundamental security issues.
Ian, if there is...
You can ask the question, if not the United States, then who? And it's a very good question to ask. And our answer is nobody. right now we're in a global environment where it's increasingly not the United States, but it's nobody else. It's not Europe, a complete question around the fundamental stability of the Eurozone right now. It's not Japan. It's not China, second largest economy, but only $4,500 per capita. They're a poor country, they say. They don't want to play that leadership role. What is it, Indonesia? It's not anybody. And look, the G0 is not a great place to be. It's not a stable place to be. It's not a new world order that's going to be with us for 20, 30, 40 years, because the world won't be able to tolerate that. But for the time being, it's where we are.
But aren't people themselves now taking the lead? I mean, if we have to look at what is happening in the Middle East right now, the change that is taking place there, the whole region appears to be in transition. The United States might not have its way as far as that is concerned, isn't it, Ian?
That's certainly true. There's the importance of social networking, the importance of sort of the global communications revolution, together with the economic impact that the financial crisis and food inflation have had on the Egyptian people, has led to a pretty significant internally motivated revolution, which has gotten rid of Mubarak. It won't get rid of the military. There's no question. That's a momentous change in the Middle East, and it will be felt in other countries around the region. But that's very different from saying that the United States is going to be able to do all of the lifting going forward.
Nouriel, what kind of impact do you think those changes that are taking place in the Middle East right now would have on things like international trade, on relations between countries in the East and countries in the West?
Well, we don't know yet. We don't know whether these political changes are going to lead to further revolts, uprising, and regime changes in other parts of the Middle East. We don't know whether there's going to be a transition to stable democracies. Unfortunately, so far, the experience with free elections and democracies in the Middle East has led us to Hamas controlling Gaza, Hezbollah effectively in control of Lebanon, a group of fundamental East Islamists being in charge of Iran, and Iraq being unstable. We do hope that what's happening in Tunisia and Middle East is going to lead to things more like Turkey or Malaysia or Indonesia, that are moderate countries that have an Islamic and Muslim majority. And we don't know whether this turmoil is going to lead to a spike in oil prices, and whether it's going to lead to a blockage of trade in oil and energy, or other things could occur if this situation becomes unstable rather than being stabilized over the next few months. So there is a huge amount of uncertainty already in a world in which there is a backlash against globalization, more restrictions on trades in goods, trades in services, on capital mobility, on labor mobility, and even technology right now.
Well, Nouriel, as you say, many unknown factors there, especially in countries in the Middle East. But what should we be looking for in the weeks and perhaps months ahead?
We'll have to see whether the developments in the Middle East lead to a orderly transition to elections with governments that are representing their own people and representing their own needs, economic and others and so on, and more stability rather than more dominant effects that lead to greater social, political, and eventually trade and financial instability. Oil prices spiked from $90 a barrel to $100 a barrel at the peak of the turmoil in Egypt. They've fallen again. If there were concerns about the supply of oil coming from the Gulf or the Suez Canal, that will be something to worry about. There was just today news that for the first time since '79, 2 military vessels of Iran are going today through the Suez Canals, and Israel is considering this as a threat. We don't know how these things are going to develop. Certainly, Iran is flexing his muscle in a number of ways, pretending that what's happening in Tunisia, in Egypt, it's to its own advantage at a time when its own people is now in the streets revolting against that regime. So it's a situation with a lot of political, social, and geostrategic and financial uncertainty.
Ian, how do you see...
There's meaningful changes, of course, that are happening every day right now in the Middle East. But there's also the possibility to get a little bit overly excited as we watch the news, and there's certainly a fair amount of tendency towards panic when you see the markets talking about an area of the world they don't really know very well. We're not all Egyptians, no matter what sort of the folks on CNN or in the New York Times might say. And there's a huge difference between a country like Egypt with sort of unemployment that is a dramatic issue, and growth that just can't keep up with these guys, and food inflation that's massive on the economic front, to some of the major oil producers and energy producers like Qatar, like Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia, where per capita incomes are vastly greater, sort of where food is a much smaller percentage of direct expenditure, and where a lot of the employment comes in and out from countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh. So clearly this is a very momentous period in the historic arc of challenges to authoritarian regimes that started with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the independence of the East Bloc countries. We're now seeing in Egypt, but let's not suddenly think that we're going to see quote-unquote contagion across the entire region.
Okay, I want to go to an email which we've just received from one of our viewers. This is Ian Uella, who writes to us from Uganda, and he writes, superpowers will always endure their status while developing nations continue to suffer as the subjects of foreign aid in quotation marks, and economic sanctions. Should we expect anything new? Nouriel?
Well, I think there's a major shift of global economic power from the west to the east, from north to south, from the advanced economies to emerging markets. And it's not just the rise of China and India or Asia. There is a lot of stuff happening, as we know, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Central Asia, even good developments in sub-Saharan Africa. So we have to think of a world in which actually emerging markets are on a rise. They're going to be able to generate a lot of growth for their own people, rely less on foreign aid. And with a change in the balance of economic, financial, and trading power, there'll be also gradually a shift in political and geopolitical power as well. It's a gradual change, but is occurring all over the world. But that leads to a world in which there are many poles of power. There is no one who is in charge. There is no one who has leadership. So it's a more unstable world because it depends on the great powers of the world, emerging ones and the old one, to sit together and agree together on the difficult issues on which they are disagreeing.
Well, talking about that shift and the fact that there could be many poles of power, we have another email which we received here, and this one's from Montreal in Quebec, from Rizwan Alam, and he writes, with China on the rise, India's energy market will expand exponentially. Do you expect India's political alignment will shift gradually away from the United States to China? Ian?
No, I don't. In fact, I think gradually it'll probably move in the other direction. Right now, India and China are fairly complementary. India's per capita income is just over $1,000. China's over $4,000. India hasn't really built out its infrastructure yet, so their economy is not nearly as resource intensive. Over the longer period of time, as India's year-on-year growth starts outstripping China, India is going to become vastly more commodities intensive, and they're going to be competing to lock up commodities for their necessary inputs with the Chinese. We already see India launching more anti-dumping cases in the WTO against China than any country against any other country. Cybersecurity is becoming a bigger issue. As India starts to become an economy that is closer in size and closer in composition to China, these guys are going to compete. And frankly, if we are in an environment in another 10 years where we still lack global governance, the potential for India-China conflict is probably the single most worrying geopolitical and geoeconomic development out there globally.
Okay, let's go to the phones. One of our viewers calling us, Kolis from Pakistan. Go ahead with your call, your question.
Hello, hi.
Hi, go ahead.
My name is Kolis. I'm calling from Pakistan. I do have a question. Basically, we are facing a lot of problems, terrorism, extremism, and a lot of internal political problems. So, my question is, what the global climate changing and economical crisis will affect on Pakistan? And another question is, you don't have any leader for any future, any political or something like that. Who will lead? Who will lead? The United States, European Union, India, China, and that's it.
Okay,
Thank you.
Let me put your question to Nouriel Roubini. What kind of impact will climate change and political instability have on a country like Pakistan?
Well, we know that actually many of the natural disasters that have occurred in the last year, from Pakistan to Russia to China to Australia, may be directly, indirectly related to global climate change. There's been an intensification of what people call natural disasters, but some of them are man-made disasters. And I think there is a risk of a vicious circle between global climate change leading to these natural disasters, these disasters leading to a lack of supply, for example, of food, what happened with fires in Russia and other parts of the world, that pushing up commodity and food prices, that leading to social and political instability in a vicious circle between the climate, the political, and the economic parts of it. So that's one of the dangers we're facing right now. That's why dealing with global climate change is as important as anything else to lead to greater economic opportunity and stability.
Ian, when we talk about the developing world, it would appear that it always seems to get a raw deal in economics forums like the G20. We have rules against subsidies, for instance, yet the United States continues to subsidize its farmers at the expense of farmers in the developing world. Can the U.S. be sanctioned in any way for its practices right now?
Well, I think you raise an important point, which is that there is a narrative that the United States talks about in terms of, we have to deal with climate change now because otherwise there are going to be all of these extraordinary emissions that's going to, ruin the polar caps and going to cause all sorts of economic dislocations. And we need a level playing field with rule of law and transparency. But a lot of folks in the emerging market world say, wait a second, you've created globalization over the last 40 years with rules that you created that benefit Western-based multinational corporations. They've been reaching out, they've taken our labor, they've taken our goods, they've made the bulk of the profits, and now that we're coming into our own, and our own corporations are doing much better, we're trying to use our legal system with our sorts of rules so that that playing field will start to shift in our favor. You're saying you don't like it. At least, in Europe, you've got a crisis right now, but people are being honest that the economics have become zero-sum. There's divergence, not convergence, and either the Germans and French are going to pay, or the Greeks, the Spaniards, and the Portuguese are going to pay. But it's zero-sum. The pie is only so big, someone has to pay. Between the West and the developing world, there is a rebalancing that is occurring. You've had convergence, you're moving towards divergence, but instead we're talking about the G20, we're talking about win-win. That we need to be honest with ourselves that we are in a more zero-sum economic environment. We need to be honest that we're in a G0. Let's set expectations realistically so we can actually build from a reasonable base.
Nouriel, we have the G20, which, as we mentioned earlier, will be taking place, the meeting will be taking place in Paris next week. What do you expect the focus will be on there?
Well, so far they meet every few months and they talk and talk and talk, and they make speeches that are set in advance. There is not really a dialogue, and there is no real agreement on anything. You have long communiques that try to find the common minimum denominator. This year, the French want to put on the table even a bigger picture issue, that is the one of how to reform the international monetary system, fixed or flexible exchange rates, the role of the dollar as a major reserve currencies, maybe reforming this Bretton Woods system. I think it's a pie in the sky. I mean, on even more basic things, we are having disagreements, let alone changing the international monetary system. I think there'll be a lot of talk this year about that topic, and Sarkozy discussed it in Davos, but I don't think there's going to be any progress. We'll have to figure out the real issues we have to deal in the short run of maintaining a global economic recovery, avoiding that the issue of energy and food security lead to economic and political instability, what to do about those things, and reach practical agreements on substantial issues rather than trying to change the entire global financial and monetary system.
Okay, gentlemen, that's where we're going to have to leave it. Time has caught up with us. Thanks to both of you for being with us.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching the show. Remember, you can watch a podcast of the show on iTunes. This week we're featuring our conversation about the future of the Arab region. On the next show, the battle over the blasphemy law in Pakistan. To what extent has the controversial legislation become a political tool in the hands of religious conservatives against liberals and minorities? Do tune in for that. We'll see you next time.